You're listening to Breaking Biz Dev with John Tyerman and Mark Wainwright. Conversations that break down, beat up, and redefine business development for the professional services firms of tomorrow. And now for your hosts, John and Mark.
Hi, gang. Welcome to another episode of Breaking Biz Dev. This is part 2 of a 2-part series. We went in depth about good marketing, bad marketing in our last episode, and today we're going to talk about good selling, bad selling. I'm John Tyerman, and I'm joined by my colleague, Mark Wainwright.
Great to be here, John. I am excited to talk about selling today, both good and bad. The big disconnect that we want to diffuse about this episode, when everybody hears the word sales, they just simply assume that it is all bad, right? When there is no version of selling that is good. There is no way that I can sell something and have it be a good experience. And I don't think that's true, and we're going to talk about that.
Well, let's do it. So let's start with bad sellers. Mark, what are the characteristics of a bad salesperson in professional services?
This is so easy to explore, John. Everyone just has these visuals just, rushing through their brains right now, these uneasy feelings in their belly. Bad sellers are pushy. They're completely focused on themselves. They want to control the entire situation really, really tightly. They make way too many assumptions about what buyers need and what they're willing to pay and what they're unwilling to pay, and how they want this process to go. They talk way too much, and they don't listen. They don't share enough information. They're not educating people. They're not letting them know about the pros and cons of even the things that they offer, right? And they don't have a process. They're just focused on the close, right? All of those characteristics, and I know there's a ton more associated with bad sellers.
Yeah, it's easy to smell that commission breath. I think our listeners fully understand what bad selling looks like, because that's why they think all sales is bad. It's because they've had these poor experiences, or at least they've been exposed to it. So just to recap, so bad sellers are pushy. They are too focused on themselves. They want to control the outcome. They want to control the process. They make too many assumptions. They talk too much. They don't listen. They don't share information. And there's no process. They're too focused on closing the deal. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's and we want to take all those things and just throw them in the trash. But let's move on.
Let's talk about good sellers.
And they're out there. Right? It happens. People actually can be good at selling, right? Sales can be good, Nobody likes to be sold, but everybody likes a sale, right? But that's what we want to talk about. So good sellers, what do they do? What do people who are really good at selling, what types of behaviors do you see from them? Well, first and foremost, they're great listeners, right? Without listening, you're potentially a solution in search of a problem, because you're just not listening to what the customer really needs. Good sellers do their homework. They do their research. They come into conversations prepared. They know, at least to whatever degree possible, what to expect without making any assumptions. They organize. They're really, really prepared for those conversations. They're focused on the buyers. They're not focused on themselves at all. They dig deep and seek out problems, customer needs, client needs. They don't make any assumptions coming into these conversations. It is so easy for experts of all types to make assumptions on what the need is, what they're trying to achieve, what they'll tolerate, what they won't tolerate, what they'll pay, what they won't pay, etc. It's so easy to make assumptions because experts are, they bring a lot into these conversations. So it's easy to make assumptions, but good sellers do not. And they manage a good process. and I reference that now. We'll reference it again in the future. Sales, just like any other process inside of a business, selling is a process, and it starts at one point and it ends at a subsequent point. And most buyers have not experienced a sales process. Most buyers out there have not walked through what it takes to buy complex professional services. You likely have done it a number of times. So this last point, managing a good sales process, is less about controlling how this thing goes and more about being a really well-equipped, empathetic guide through an often confusing, complex process of buying. Because frankly, buying professional services that have any level of complexity is hard. So good sellers are really good guides.
So it sounds like there's really two key characteristics or traits. I guess one would be curiosity for a salesperson, right? And so if you're curious, you're going to listen, you're going to do your homework, you're going to focus on others, you're going to seek out problems and needs, you're not going to make assumptions. And then the other skill that I'm hearing is organization. So you're organized and you're prepared for each interaction with buyers, and you're organized in the sense that you're managing a good sales process. Does that sound right?
It is right. And I will tell you, John, again and again, the most successful individuals that I have worked with in professional services and selling professional services are the people who are organized and focused on the client, right? And they keep a good schedule and they can run a good process. It's not the people who are the extroverts and the folks that walk into the room and shoot from the hip and just suck all of the oxygen out of the room with their talk. And it really are the folks who are really, really curious, excellent listeners, and who are very, very organized. And I would say those traits aren't commonly associated with people who sell. So this is part of that. This is part of that sort of maybe a little provocative, point of view that we're coming in here with, right? They're not the schmoozers. The good sellers are not the schmoozers. They are the people who are organized and they are great listeners.
Well, that's our job, right? We're breaking down business development and we're breaking up sales today.
That's why we're here.
So we talked about bad sellers and the characteristics of bad sellers. We talked about the characteristics of good sellers. I'm really excited about this next part. So let's get into what it means to be a good buyer versus a bad buyer.
Since sales is completely, particularly with professional services, since selling is focused on these two parties where you've got sellers and buyers coming together through a series of interactions, conversations, that happens over a period of time. These sales processes can be long, they can be complex, they can have their ups and downs and their ins and outs. It's important to look at both sides, right? So, yeah, good buyers. Good buyers are super important to look to kind of dig into. So, some of the characteristics that good buyers, some of the behaviors that good buyers display are great communication, open and sharing with information. They value a good relationship. They're collaborative, right? They understand that everybody's trying to reach this goal together, so we got to work together. They know that trust is critical. They place more importance on value than price. And good buyers don't focus on price too early. A good buyer really needs to kind of let the information come to them. They need to take it in, process it, kind of work through it, prioritize certain things that are more important to them and less important to them. And then when the time comes, they need to consider price. Because, otherwise, if we focus on price too early, we're kind of limiting our exposure and kind of knowledge and awareness of what potential solutions there are out there.
That's very interesting. Focusing on price too early in the conversation, so that's a sign of a poor buyer. Good buyers' value is more important than that price. Trust is absolutely critical because you have to trust the service provider to deliver on that value. Good buyers are collaborative. They share information and communicate well. I think I hit on all those points. Did I?
Yeah. All that really sets this buyer-seller relationship up well.
So, what would a bad buyer look like?
Yeah, it's, and that's a funny concept even to begin with, right? You think, oh, there are bad buyers out there. I think people very easily can associate certain behaviors, just like we talked about a few minutes ago, with bad sellers, right? But I don't think that people realize that, oh, there are actually good and bad ways to buy as well, and being a bad buyer in a buying-selling relationship can be just as problematic as a bad seller. So, bad buyers hold their cards close to their vest, right? That's this old-time saying, this poker saying, right, where they're not sharing information, they're not being very collaborative, so they're holding their cards close to their vest, right? Bad buyers self-determine their needs. So even coming into this buying-selling process, they've already decided everything they need and they don't need. They're not ready to learn. So typically, right, these are the people that are going to be a cost-first buyer. This is all we need. We're looking for some sort of, this is not a relational relationship we're looking for. It's not relational. This is transactional. This is something that, lowest priced is going to win. So they've self-determined their needs, right? Bad buyers believe that the buying-selling situation is zero-sum game, right? In order for the buyer to win, the seller has to lose, right? They have to give something up that they're not willing to give up, right? We can't create a potential, win-win situation out of all this. The seller has to give up something, and we have to gain something in order for this to be a positive outcome for us, right? So they're looking for a deal, right? They want to exact their pound of flesh out of the seller, right? And all this says price is the main factor in this buying process. So it's all about price. And bad buyers simply assume that the seller is out to get them, right? There's no trust established. They don't need or want to establish trust or establish a relationship there. There's no give and take. And this creates a very challenging situation.
What I like about this, and this it plays well into the good seller characteristics, is a good seller is a good listener, right? We've established that. Well, it's hard to listen when the buyer won't share the information, right? And so I think that was an interesting kind of connection there that I just had between, bad buyers hold their cards close to their vest. Bad buyers also self-determine their needs. What I thought of when you were explaining that was there are known unknowns and there are unknown unknowns. And what I mean by that is, like, you know what you don't know, but sometimes you don't know what you don't know too. And if you're coming into the conversation as a buyer confident that you know exactly what you need, it makes sense that that's a bad characteristic, or it's a characteristic of a bad buyer.
Right, and all too often we point at the seller as being the person who's responsible for this really difficult situation, but the buyer can have just as much responsibility in making this a bad or good situation.
That's exactly right. So, Mark, you've developed this this framework that can help listeners visualize the relationships between good sellers and good buyers, or bad sellers and good buyers, each one of those different combinations. So can you explain this framework that you've developed?
So as we mentioned, there's an interaction between these two groups, the seller and the buyer, right? And we just talked about good sellers and good buyers and bad buyers. So what happens when those two variables come colliding together, in any given scenario, right? What happens when we run into a good buyer and a bad seller? What happens when there's a bad seller and a bad buyer? Like what's going on there? So I took it all and I laid it out into a 2x2 matrix, which is often called the magic quadrant, or so it's 4 small boxes inside of the large box. And what I do as I talk through this is I've got buyers on the horizontal axis and sellers on the vertical axis, and obviously in the lower left corner, we've got our wonderful poor, bad buyers and bad sellers, and then in the top right quadrant is where both are just doing a really wonderful job, where we have good sellers and good buyers, right? So I've got my 2x2, and hopefully people can kind of picture along with us here, and we can walk through it. Let's walk through it.
All right, so let's start with the bad selling and bad buying, that lower left quadrant. I think we've been talking about the bad sellers and bad buyers first to begin. So let's start there.
Yeah, disastrous place to be, right? This is where the bad sellers and bad buyers come crashing together, and what happens, right? What does this look like, right? The focus is on price and money. It's not on value on both sides, right? Not just the buyer side, but the seller side as well. Neither one is willing to kind of understand the value in this whole thing. It's just transaction. Trust is low, or trust is non-existent. No one looks at trust being an important part of this, and no one's willing to kind of extend themselves to develop trust. Both parties in this lower left quadrant are oriented on themselves, right? Our needs are primary, both from the buying and the selling perspective. So we're not coming together, and we're not focusing on the needs of others. There's no process. The process is all over the place. It's fast and slow. Communication is herky-jerky. Maybe there's a conversation. Maybe there's a couple emails. Maybe there's huge breaks in between. We're not communicating well. Every time the buyer and seller get back together again after a long hiatus, they're wondering, is this going anywhere? And they both have completely lost track of where the conversation left off last time. So they have to restart all over again, and maybe new people come in, and the dynamics are strange, and it's super hard. So you can't make progress. There's a ton of ghosting going on, right? Both on both sides, right? A lot of times, the buyers get blamed for ghosting, but maybe the seller just loses track of things, and you get emails or other communications sort of lost in your inbox, and the seller loses track of things, right? There's not enough focus. So all in all, this looks like a combative process, where they're gonna have at it. They're gonna duke it out, right? This is the Wild West gunfight, right? And either they're gonna win or we're gonna win. Bad situation, clearly, right? You can't say enough bad things about when a bad seller and a bad buyer come together.
And I think a lot of what you explained is why I think people think that sales is a bad word, right? So, there's a focus on money, not value. Trust is low. The process is all over the place. People are getting ghosted. So yeah, that's a disastrous place to be, as you said. So let's talk about what it means to be a good seller working with a bad buyer.
Right. So think through all those things we just talked about, the good characteristics of buying and what happens if you have a bad, inexperienced, buyer kind of coming into the situation, right? So sales needs to recognize this is the case, and they need to guide the process, not control the process, but guide the process, right? Because the buyer might be inexperienced. They might be exhibiting some bad buying behaviors. Buying complex services is tricky. So the seller needs to understand this and say, okay, this is new to them. We need to guide this process. Buyers can feel threatened. A bad buyer in this situation can feel threatened. Okay, this person's trying to take control of the process. They're trying to have us do things that we don't want to do, make decisions we don't want to make. They can feel threatened. So it's important that the good seller helps mitigate that by, not grabbing control of thing, understanding that control in any buying, selling situation flows back and forth between both parties, but it needs a guide because it needs to get somewhere, because the good seller is hopefully confident that they have a solution that will help the buyer achieve whatever business results or business outcomes they have in mind. So they have to keep the process moving, right? Bad buyers aren't sure what information is most important to share. Metrics, goals. So they share very little, right? So they're not forthcoming with sufficient information to inform the seller on what elements are most important, what needs to change, what needs to be added, what needs to be pulled out of this potential solution. So it's an asymmetric situation, right? Where parties are coming at it at different levels. And I think it's possible to move through a situation like this, but both parties need to kind of recognize it. And I think particularly when we're talking about a good seller coming into a bad buying process, they need to understand that they need to, carefully, strategically guide the process.
Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest takeaway that I have is as a salesperson, recognizing when you're working with a bad buyer and how can you do the things that you need to do to help guide them and help them, coach them up on how to be a good buyer, right?
I love it. Absolutely.
All right, let's flip the script a little bit and let's talk about what happens when you've got a bad salesperson with a good buyer.
Boy, this is so frustrating. So frustrating, right? You're coming in, a good buyer is going to come into the situation. They want to build a relationship because they know that's important. They're like, look, we have to be able to get synced up in this, So I'm going to share all the information I can, but the seller wants to rush through it quickly, right? This is that demo. Like, all right, great. This is our first time talking. Hey, you mind if I demo the product to you? Here we go.
Let me show you my capabilities deck.
Yeah, here we go. Here's the deck. I'm going to share my screen. And you're like, oh boy, here we go. Right. So they're focused on the close, right? Sales screws up and doesn't set next steps, right? So they're not keeping everyone informed and up to speed on, okay, here's what we're going to talk about now. The next conversation is going to look like this. Let's figure out when that's going to be. Let's figure out who needs to be there. Let's all get prepared so that we know what's going to happen next, right? The sales is not doing that, right? There's a lack of clarity. It's all over the place. Buyers are sharing information, but that doesn't seem to be settling in, right? It doesn't seem like the seller is listening to it. It's like, we just talked about this, right? And you're showing me something completely different. What happened, right? The sellers come into the situation making a ton of assumptions. They assume what the buyers need. It's not a customized solution to their specific priorities or preferences. And the process just feels super transactional. Like, boy, the seller just wants to close this deal because he's got 16 more working, and it's not a priority for them and just not feeling connected to it. So, bad situation.
Yeah, that does sound like a really frustrating situation, especially as a buyer. So buyers, when we have a bad salesperson and a good buyer, I think the one thing that you shared with me that really stood out was when buyers share that information, but the sellers don't understand that they need to, that the buyers are saying, hey, help me. This is my situation. This is what I'm going through. This is the pain that I'm going through. Do you have a solution? But then it's just not being picked up by the salesperson. That was one of the biggest takeaways there. But yeah, not setting the next steps, not saying, okay, let's look at the calendar, let's get another meeting on the books to talk about X, and then we'll talk about Y. And then being focused on the close. That's it does not feel good as a buyer when you pick up that the salesperson is just trying to close this deal and get to the next one. It diminishes trust, which is such a huge part of this relationship.
Exactly.
Well, we talked about the different combinations of good and bad. We talked about bad selling and bad buying. Let's get to nirvana. Let's talk about good selling and good buying. What does it look like when buyers and sellers are having that dance and are hitting their stride?
Boy, it just feels so good, right? So different from that bottom left quadrant, right? that bottom left quadrant where people come in, they don't know what's going on. It's just a transactional situation. This is so different. It's collaborative. People are sharing information. The focus is totally on value. What results do you want to achieve, and how are you assigning value to that? How can we help you achieve those results? So there's a really deep shared understanding of client needs and the results they want, and you achieve that through a really good sort of curious process, a really good discovery process.
Yeah, the question that I like to ask in those scenarios is, what does success look like to you?
Sure. Yeah, great one. Yeah, that's a great one. Hopefully, the buyer has experienced a little bit to know what to expect, but also the seller is coming into it thinking, look, this is going to go best for both of us if we overlay some sort of a process to this, just a way we do this, right? We want to maintain some energy and some momentum. The really good buying selling situations seem to just sort of move, right? They have this energy to them. They have an excitement to them that kind of increases as things go, where people are starting to really, bring that result into clearer and clearer focus. And both parties really recognize that, so they're really excited about the direction that this is headed, right? And the buyer is thinking, boy, this is fantastic. We're going to achieve what we want to achieve. And our sense is, at least, to this point, that these guys can help us achieve that, and and the value is there. Whatever price they're going to assign to this thing, it's like, but if they can actually help us achieve that, this is amazing. We would actually pay 10 times that, because we're going to get so much value out of this, right? Communication is great. There's no ghosting. There's a lot of communication. It's really open. People are really sharing not just the details and information, but just what they're feeling, how things are going. Is it going well for you? I think we need to communicate. We need more. We need to focus on this. We need to focus less on that, right? There's really a 1 + 1 = 3 approach to this, right? This is not a zero sum. This is where both parties are going to win. So it's a mutually beneficial process. It's a win-win, right? Both benefit from a really good buying and a really good selling process.
All right. Well, good selling, bad selling. This concludes our episode today on Breaking Biz Dev. This has been a fantastic conversation, Mark. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I love this one. It's great that people can recognize that both buyers and sellers have a responsibility and an opportunity to create a great win-win situation.
Excellent. Well, thank you for listening, and till next time.
Thanks for listening to Breaking Biz Dev. Subscribe on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or listen to the show at breakingbizdev.com. This episode was produced by Red Cedar Marketing. If you think a business podcast is right for your company, visit redcedarmarketing.com to learn more.